Chapter 1. The Burial. The sun hung heavy over the pampas, a molten disk bleeding gold into the endless sea of grass. It was March 25th, 2025, and the air carried the dry, earthy scent of late summer, tinged with the faint rot of something the wind couldn't quite sweep away. Mateo stood at the edge of a shallow pit, his calloused hands gripping the worn handle of a shovel. Sweat beaded on his brow, tracing lines through the dust that clung to his weathered face. He was 38, but today he felt ancient, his broad shoulders hunched under a weight no man could see. Before him lay Clara, his wife, wrapped in a simple white shroud. Her dark hair peeked out at the edges, still lustrous even in death, a cruel reminder of the life that had slipped away 3 days ago. The illness had come fast, fever, then delirium, then silence. No doctor from the village could name it, and the nearest hospital was a day's ride across the plains. Now she was here, in this hole he dug with his own hands, beneath the vast Argentine sky that seemed to mock his smallness. Lucia, their daughter, stood a few paces back, her thin frame trembling despite the heat. At 14, she was all sharp angles and quiet eyes. Clara's eyes deep brown and searching. She clutched a rosary, its wooden beads worn smooth from years of her mother's prayers, and stared at the shroud as if willing it to move. Mateo wanted to say something, to bridge the chasm of silence between them, but the words stuck in his throat like burrs. He drove the shovel into the earth instead, the blade biting deep with a dull thud. The soil was dry at first, crumbling away in clumps, but as he dug deeper to cover Clara's body, it grew heavier, damp with a strange, cloying moisture. He frowned, pausing to wipe his brow. The pampas hadn't seen rain in weeks. Why was the ground wet here? He shook off the thought. Grief was playing tricks on him, turning the familiar into something foreign. Lucia's soft voice broke the quiet, reciting a prayer under her breath. Santa Maria, Madre de Dios, ruega por nosotros. The words drifted over the plains, fragile as the grass bending in the breeze. Mateo heaved another shovelful of dirt, and the shovel struck something solid. A jolt ran up his arms, jarring his teeth. He froze, peering into the hole. The earth had parted around Clara's shroud, and beneath it, where there should have been only more soil, a pale, glistening mass protruded, like roots, but thicker, softer, almost alive. It pulsed faintly, a slow rhythm that made his stomach turn. He blinked, half expecting it to vanish, but it remained, threading through the dirt like veins under skin. A faint cloud of dust. No, not dust. Something finer, like pollen, rose from it, shimmering in the sunlight before dissolving into the air. Papa? Lucia's voice was small, uncertain. She'd stepped closer, her shadow falling across the grave. What's that? Nothing, Mateo said too quickly, his voice rough. He didn't look at her. Couldn't. Just a root from the grass. He drove the shovel in again, harder this time, slicing through the mass. It gave way with a wet, tearing sound, and a sour, damp smell wafted up, like mushrooms left too long in the dark. He gritted his teeth and kept working, piling dirt over Clara's shroud, until the white fabric disappeared, until the strange thing beneath was buried too. The hole filled slowly, each shovelful a seal on his loss, but that pulsing lingered in his mind, an echo he couldn't shake. When it was done, he planted a crude wooden cross at the head of the mound, its shadow stretching long and thin across the earth. Lucia knelt beside it, pressing the rosary into the soil, as if it could anchor her mother there. The wind picked up, rustling the grass in a low, mournful sigh. And for a moment, Matteo thought he heard something else, a whisper, too faint to catch, carried on the breeze. He turned, scanning the horizon. Nothing but the pampas stared back, vast and indifferent. He took Lucia's hand, her fingers cold against his, and led her back to the farmhouse. The sun dipped lower, painting the plains red, and the grave sat silent behind them. But beneath the fresh-turned earth, where Clara rested, or should have, the pale tendrils stirred, threading deeper, tasting the air with invisible spores. The day was ending, and something else was beginning. Chapter 2. The whisper night draped the pampas in a heavy shroud, the vast plain swallowed by darkness, save for the faint silver of a waxing moon. Inside the farmhouse, the air was thick with stillness, broken only by the soft hiss of the kerosene lamp flickering on the wooden table. Matteo sat slumped in a creaking chair, his broad hands wrapped around a chipped gourd of mate. The bitter brew scalded his tongue, but he barely noticed. His eyes were fixed on Clara's photograph, propped against a cracked vase. She smiled in the faded image, her dark hair tumbling over one shoulder, her gaze warm and alive. It was a lie now, that warmth and the ache of it gnawed at him like a dull blade. Upstairs, Lucia slept, or so he hoped. The floorboards hadn't creaked in hours, and the silence from her room felt like a mercy after the day's wait. He'd sent her to bed with a murmured promise that tomorrow would be easier, though he didn't believe it himself. The grave lingered in his mind, that damp earth and those strange pulsing roots threading through it. He took another sip of mate, the steam curling up to sting his eyes, and tried to push the memory down. It was nothing, he told himself. A trick of exhaustion, a farmer's hands finding oddities in the soil. The pampas were old. They held secrets beneath their grass. That was all. A soft tap broke the quiet. Sharp, deliberate, like a knuckle against glass. Matteo's head jerked up, his gaze snapping to the window across the room. The curtains hung limp, framing a square of night beyond the warped panes. He waited, breath held, but the sound didn't come again. Just the wind, he thought, though the grass outside stood still, unrippled by any breeze. He rose, his boots scuffing the worn floor, and crossed to the window. The glass was cool under his palm as he peered out. The plains stretched endless and black, the horizon lost to shadow. Clara's grave was out there, a low mound barely distinguishable in the dark, but it seemed wrong. The earth looked churned, uneven, though he couldn't be sure from this distance. Another tap, fainter this time, like a fingertip testing the silence. Matteo's pulse quickened. He leaned closer, his breath fogging the glass, and strained to see. Nothing moved. No foxes, no stray dogs, no gauchos riding late. The pampas slept, or pretended to. Then a whisper slithered through the night, soft as a sigh. Matteo. His name spoken in Clara's voice. Low, tender, the way she'd called him home from the fields. His heart lurched, a sharp pang of longing and fear, twisting together. He stumbled back, the chair scraping loudly as his legs caught it. The room spun for a moment, the lamp's glow casting jagged shadows on the walls. He pressed a hand to his chest, willing his breathing to steady. It couldn't be her. Clara was gone, buried under 6 feet of pampas dirt. He'd held her cold hand, kissed her still forehead. He knew death when he saw it, and yet that voice, it clawed at him, tugging at memories he couldn't silence. He turned back to the window, half expecting to see her standing there, her shroud trailing in the grass. But the night was empty, the grave undisturbed, or so it seemed. A faint scent crept into the room, barely noticeable at first, like damp earth after rain. It wasn't the mate, nor the dry wood of the farmhouse. Mateo sniffed, his brow furrowing. It reminded him of the grave, that sour fungal tang when he'd struck those roots. He glanced at the floor, half expecting to see spores dusting the boards. But there was nothing, just the worn planks and the flickering light. The whisper didn't come again, but the silence felt heavier now, pressing against his ears like water. He drained the last of the mate, the bitterness grounding him, and set the gourd down with a trembling hand. Sleep was a distant hope, but he couldn't stay here, staring into the dark. He climbed the stairs, each step groaning under his weight, and paused at Lucia's door. It was ajar, her small form curled beneath a quilt, her breathing shallow but steady. The rosary lay coiled on her pillow, glinting faintly in the moonlight that slipped through her window. She looked peaceful, untouched by whatever haunted him downstairs. He pulled the door shut, the latch clicking softly, and returned to his own room. Lying on the narrow bed he'd once shared with Clara, Mateo stared at the ceiling, the whispers echoing in his skull. The wind picked up outside, a low moan rattling the shutters, and he told himself that's all it had been, a trick of the plains, a cruel mimicry of her voice. But as he drifted into an uneasy sleep, the scent of damp earth followed him, threading through his dreams like roots seeking water. Out in the darkness, the grave waited, its soil shifting ever so slightly, as if something beneath it stirred. Chapter 3. The Return. Dawn crept over the pampas with a sluggish reluctance, the sky a bruised gray that dulled the golden grass to a muted sheen. Mateo woke to the sound of his own ragged breathing, the echo of Clara's whispered voice still clinging to the edges of his mind like cobwebs. The bed beside him was empty, the sheets cold, and for a fleeting moment he reached out, expecting her warmth. Reality crashed back, an ache sharper than the dawn, and he sat up, rubbing his face with hands that smelled faintly of earth, though he hadn't touched soil since the burial. The farmhouse was quiet, save for the faint creak of settling wood. He pulled on his boots, the leather stiff and dusty, and shuffled downstairs. The lamp from last night had burned out, leaving a thin trail of soot on the table. Clara's photograph stared back at him, her smile unchanged, and he turned it face down with a pang of guilt. The whisper lingered in his memory. Mateo. And he couldn't shake the feeling that the night had left something behind. He stepped to the window, peering out at the grave. The mound looked uneven, the dirt piled higher on one side, as if pushed from below. His stomach tightened. Had the wind done that, or... A scream tore through the silence, high and piercing. Lucia! Mateo bolted up the stairs, his boots pounding the steps, and threw open her door. She stood in the center of her room, her quilt clutched to her chest, her wide eyes fixed on the corner near the window. Her dark hair was tangled, her face pale as the shroud they'd buried Clara in. "Papa!" she gasped, pointing a trembling hand. "It was Mama! She was here!" Mateo's heart thudded against his ribs. He followed her gaze. but the corner was empty. Just the chipped dresser and a square of gray light spilling through the glass. "Lucia, what are you talking about?" His voice was rough, strained, though he tried to keep it steady for her sake. She shook her head, tears welling up. "She was standing there," Lucia said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "Smiling at me. She didn't say anything, just smiled. And then she was gone." She hugged the quilt tighter, the rosary slipping from her fingers to clatter on the floor. Matteo crossed the room in 2 strides and picked it up, the beads cool against his palm. He scanned the space again. Nothing. No footprints. No trace of anyone. But the air felt wrong, heavy with that same damp, earthy scent he'd caught last night. Stronger now, like a cellar left unopened too long. "Dreams, Mija," he said, kneeling beside her. "You were dreaming. It happens when we're sad." He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering on her cheek. She was cold, too cold for a room that should have held the night's lingering warmth. Lucia shook her head again, insistent. "It wasn't a dream, Papa. I woke up, and she was there. I saw her." Her voice cracked, and she buried her face in the quilt, muffling a sob. Matteo pulled her close, his arms enveloping her small frame, but his eyes darted back to the corner. The floorboards there looked off. A faint dusting of something pale shimmered in the dim light. Powder, fine as ash, scattered in a rough arc. He squinted, leaning closer without letting go of Lucia. It glowed faintly, a sickly luminescence that made his skin prickle. He stood guiding Lucia to the bed and grabbed a rag from the dresser. "Stay here," he said, keeping his tone firm to mask the unease coiling in his gut. He crouched by the dust, wiping it up with the cloth. It clung to the fabric, sticky and damp, not like ash at all, more like spores, the kind he'd seen on rotting logs in the wet season. The smell hit him then, sharp and fungal, twisting his stomach. He folded the rag tight and shoved it into his pocket, his mind racing. This wasn't normal. Not the whisper, not the grave, not this. "Papa, don't leave me," Lucia whispered, her eyes pleading. He forced a smile, though it felt brittle on his lips. "I'm just going outside to check something. I'll be right back." He squeezed her shoulder and headed downstairs, his boots echoing in the empty house. The morning air bit at his face as he stepped onto the porch, the plains stretching out in a muted hush. He strode toward the grave, his breath clouding in the chill. Up close, it was worse than he'd thought. The soil was churned, not just shifted. Clumps of dirt lay scattered as if something had clawed its way up, and thin, white tendrils poked through the surface, glistening wetly in the dawn light. Matteo's knees buckled. He dropped to the ground, his hands hovering over the mound. The shroud, he'd buried her deep, covered her with heavy earth. She couldn't have. No, he wouldn't think it. But the spores in Lucia's room, the whisper, her vision of Clara, it all pressed against him, a weight he couldn't name. He dug his fingers into the soil, needing to prove it was still there, still sealed. The dirt was cold, damp, and as he brushed it aside, those tendrils pulsed faintly, threading deeper into the earth. He staggered back, his hands trembling, and wiped them on his trousers. The grave was intact, no shroud, no body exposed, but something was wrong, terribly wrong. The Pampas watched in silence, the grass swaying gently as if mocking his fear. Behind him, the farmhouse loomed, and he knew Lucia was waiting, her trust in him fraying. He turned back, the damp scent clinging to his skin, and wondered what he'd brought into their home when he'd buried Clara beneath the roots. Chapter 4. The Neighbor. The sun climbed higher over the pampas, its light harsh and unforgiving, casting long shadows across the grass that rippled like a restless sea. Mateo stood on the porch, his hands still gritty with the damp soil from Clara's grave, his mind churning with what he'd seen. Those pale tendrils, the churned earth, Lucia's tear-streaked face. He couldn't stay in the farmhouse, not with that scent of rot lingering in the air and his daughter's words. She was here, echoing in his skull. He needed answers, or at least someone to tell him he wasn't losing his grip on reality. "Lucia, get your coat," he called, stepping inside long enough to grab his hat. She appeared at the top of the stairs, her eyes red-rimmed but steady, the rosary clutched tight in her fist. She didn't ask where they were going, maybe she didn't want to know, and followed him out to the old truck parked beside the house. The engine sputtered to life, a rough growl that broke the plain's silence, and they rattled down the dirt track toward Don Ramon's ranch, a mile west. The gaucho was older, gruff, a man of the pampas through and through. Mateo hoped his practicality could anchor him. The ranch came into view, a squat sprawl of weathered wood and corrugated tin, cattle pens stretching out behind it. Don Ramon stood near the barn, his broad frame bent over a fence post, hammering nails with a rhythm born of decades. His gray hair was tied back, his face creased like leather left too long in the sun. He straightened as the truck rolled up, wiping sweat from his brow with a scarred hand. "Mateo," he grunted, nodding. "Didn't expect you today. The girl, all right?" Mateo cut the engine and stepped out, Lucia trailing behind, her gaze fixed on the ground. "She's shaken," he said, his voice low. "Something's wrong, Ramon. I need to talk." The older man's eyes narrowed, flicking to Lucia, then back to Mateo. He gestured toward the barn, away from the open, where the wind couldn't carry their words. Inside, the air was thick with the musk of hay and cattle, the dim light filtering through gaps in the walls. Mateo recounted it all. The whisper, the grave, Lucia's vision of Clara, the spores on her floor. His hands flexed as he spoke, the memory of that damp earth still clinging to his skin. Ramon listened, his face hardening, until Mateo finished. "You're tired," he said gruffly, crossing his arms. "Grief does things, makes you hear what isn't there. The girl's just dreaming it up." "I saw the dirt move," Mateo snapped, sharper than he meant. "And that smell, it's not right." Before Ramon could argue, a voice cut through the barn's quiet. A boy's voice, clear and bright. "Papa, come see." Mateo froze. Ramon's head jerked toward the sound, his breath catching. It came from deeper in the barn, near the shadowed stalls. "That's Pedro," Ramon whispered, his voice trembling. Pedro, his son, dead 5 years, drowned in a flash flood that swept through the pampas one brutal spring. Mateo grabbed Lucia's arm, pulling her close, but Ramon was already moving, his boots thudding against the packed earth. "Wait!" Mateo called, but the older man didn't stop, drawn toward the voice like a moth to flame. In the farthest stall, a figure stood. It was Pedro, or something wearing his shape, a boy of 12, wiry and sun-browned, his dark hair falling into eyes that were too wide, too still. He wore the same patched shirt Ramon had buried him in, now pristine, and smiled a smile that didn't reach those glassy eyes. "Papa," he said again, stepping forward, his bare feet leaving faint trails of pale dust on the floor. A sour, fungal scent wafted from him, sharp enough to make Mateo's throat tighten. Ramon staggered, his hands outstretched. "Hijo mío," he choked, tears welling in his eyes. "How?" The boy reached out, his fingers brushing Ramon's arm, and a faint cloud of spores puffed from the contact, shimmering in the slanted light. Ramon coughed, a wet, ragged sound, and sank to his knees, clutching at the boy's hand. Mateo lunged forward, yanking him back. "It's not him," he shouted, his voice cracking. "Look at it, Ramon." The boy tilted his head, unnaturally smooth, and beckoned again, the smile widening. Up close, his skin was waxy, too perfect, and thin tendrils curled from his fingernails, pulsing faintly. Ramon wheezed, his face paling as he stared into those empty eyes. "Pedro," he murmured, reaching again. But Mateo dragged him toward the barn door, Lucia clinging to his side. The boy didn't follow, just stood there, shedding spores that drifted like ash, his voice calling softly. "Papa, don't go." Outside, the sun glared down, indifferent. Ramon collapsed against the truck, coughing harder now, a thread of blood staining his lips. Mateo's hands shook as he helped him up, his mind reeling. It wasn't Clara alone. Whatever this was, it was spreading, pulling the dead from memory to where their faces. Lucia pressed against him, her rosary digging into his arm. "What's happening, Papa?" she whispered, her voice small. "I don't know," he said, staring back at the barn. The boy was gone, the shadows empty. But that smell lingered, carried on the wind across the pampas. Ramon's coughs echoed behind him, a warning Mateo couldn't ignore. Whatever he'd unearthed with Clara, it wasn't finished with them or anyone else. Chapter 5. The Spread. The pampas shimmered under a noon sun that offered no warmth, its light flattening the grasslands into a stark, endless plain. Mateo drove the truck back from Don Ramon's ranch, the engine's rumble a frail shield against the silence pressing in from all sides. Lucia sat beside him, her knees drawn up, the rosary wound tight around her fingers like a lifeline. In the rearview mirror, Ramon slumped in the truck bed, his coughs hacking through the air, wet, guttural, each one a reminder of the boy in the barn, that waxy smile shedding spores. Mateo's hands gripped the wheel, knuckles white, his mind a tangle of fear and disbelief. Whatever this was, it wasn't stopping at his doorstep. The village came into view, a loose cluster of adobe houses and tin-roofed shacks huddled against the vastness, a general store and a weathered church marking its heart. Normally the streets would hum with the quiet rhythm of daily life, gauchos herding cattle, women hanging laundry, children darting between homes. Today, though, the air buzzed with something else, voices overlapping and frantic, rising from a crowd near the church. Mateo slowed the truck, his gut twisting as he saw them. Villagers, dozens of them, gathered in a tight knot, their faces lit with a strange, feverish joy. He parked at the edge and stepped out, helping Ramon down as Lucia followed, her eyes wide. The crowd parted slightly, revealing figures among them, familiar yet wrong. An old woman, Donna Rosa, wept, as she clung to a stooped figure in a faded shawl. Her mother, dead a decade, now smiling silently with lips too pale. A young man, Javier, laughed as he embraced a boy who drowned in the river 2 summers back, the child's hair dripping wet, though his clothes were dry. Everywhere Mateo looked, the returned stood among the living. Grandparents, siblings, children, each one a perfect echo of memory, their skin smooth and waxen, their eyes too still. "They're back!" a woman cried, her voice breaking with rapture. "God heard us." Others nodded, some falling to their knees in prayer, their hands reaching for these silent mimics. Mateo's breath caught as he saw Lucia scanning the crowd, her gaze searching, hoping, he knew, for Clara. He grabbed her shoulder, pulling her close. "Don't," he whispered, sharp enough to make her flinch. She didn't argue, but her fingers tightened on the rosary. Ramon coughed again, doubling over, and a few villagers turned, their joy faltering. "He's sick," Mateo said, loud enough to carry. "Something's wrong with these things." He gestured at the returned, his voice trembling with the weight of what he'd seen. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Doubt, then anger. "They're our families," Javier snapped, his arms still around the drowned boy. "You buried Clara. Maybe you're jealous she hasn't come to you." Before Mateo could retort, a familiar figure stepped from the church doors. Clara, or what wore her face. She moved with a slow grace, her dark hair swaying, her simple dress untouched by the grave's dirt. The crowd hushed, parting as she approached. Lucia gasped, "Mama!" and lunged forward, but Mateo caught her, his arms locking around her waist. "No!" he barked, his voice raw. Clara's mimic stopped, tilting her head, her smile soft and empty. A faint cloud of spores drifted from her, catching the sunlight like dust motes, and the air thickened with that sour fungal tang. "She's not real," Mateo said, more to himself than Lucia, though his heart ached to believe otherwise. The mimic reached out, her fingers brushing the air, and a villager near her, a wiry man named Esteban, coughed suddenly, doubling over as spores shimmered around him. No one else seemed to notice, their eyes fixed on their own returned, lost in a haze of longing. Mateo dragged Lucia back to the truck, Ramon stumbling behind, his breathing labored. "We need Sophia," he muttered, shoving Ramon into the cab. Sophia, the village nurse, lived on the outskirts, a practical woman, sharp-eyed, someone who might see past this madness. The truck roared to life, and they peeled away, the crowd's murmurs fading into the wind. Lucia pressed her face to the window, watching Clara's mimic until it vanished from sight, tears streaking her cheeks. Sophia's house was a low adobe building, its yard dotted with herbs and a rusted bicycle. She stepped out as they pulled up, her dark braids swinging, her brow furrowing at the sight of Ramon's pallor. "What's happened?" she asked, her voice clipped but calm. Mateo spilled it all. The grave, the spores, Pedro, the village, his words tumbling over each other as Sophia ushered them inside. She sat Ramon on a cot, pressing a stethoscope to his chest. His coughs rattled, and she frowned, pulling back. His lungs sound clogged, she said, her tone shifting to unease. She swabbed his mouth, peering at the sample under a cracked magnifying glass. "There's something in there. Threads, like roots." Mateo's stomach dropped. "It's spreading," he said, glancing at Lucia, who sat silent, her rosary trembling in her hands. Sophia met his eyes, her expression hardening. If this is what I think, it's not a miracle. It's a sickness. Outside, the wind carried faint voices from the village, cries of joy turning to coughs, the pampas swallowing the sound. Mateo looked at his daughter, then at Ramon's labored breathing, and knew the roots he'd unearthed were growing deeper, reaching for them all. Chapter 6: The Truth. The air inside Sophia's small house hung thick and stale, the faint hum of a generator underscoring the silence that followed her words. Mateo stood near the cot where Don Ramon lay, his chest rising and falling with shallow, wheezing breaths, each one punctuated by a wet cough that left flecks of blood on his lips. Lucia sat in the corner, her knees drawn up, the rosary a tight coil around her fingers as she stared at the floor. Sophia knelt by a rickety table, her dark eyes narrowed as she adjusted a battered microscope, its lens trained on the swab she'd taken from Ramon's mouth. The room smelled of antiseptic and something darker, that sour, fungal tang that seemed to follow them now. Inescapable. Mateo's hands flexed at his sides, still gritty from the grave, his mind replaying Clara's mimic in the village square. Her silent smile, those outstretched hands shedding spores. A sickness, he repeated, his voice low, testing Sophia's claim. You're saying this thing brought them back? He wanted her to deny it, to offer some other explanation. Madness, a shared hallucination. But the weight in his gut told him she wouldn't. Sophia didn't look up, her fingers steady as she tweaked the microscope's focus. Not brought back, she said, her tone clipped, precise, mimicked. Look. She slid the scope toward him, gesturing for him to see. Mateo hesitated, then leaned over the eyepiece. The slide revealed a tangle of pale threads, thin, glistening, weaving together like a spider's web, but alive, pulsing faintly. Some threads branched into clusters that looked disturbingly like cells, human-like yet twisted, wrong. He pulled back, his throat tightening. What is that? Fungus, Sophia said, standing to face him. A kind I've never seen. It's not just growing, it's copying. Those threads. They're mimicking human tissue, probably from what it finds in the air, the skin, the lungs. She nodded at Ramon, whose cough rattled louder now, his face slick with sweat. It's in him? And if it's in the village? She trailed off, her gaze flicking to Lucia, then back to Mateo. You said it started with Clara's grave? He nodded, the memory clawing at him. The damp earth, those pulsing roots he'd struck with the shovel. I hit something when I buried her, he said, his voice rough, white like veins. It breathed out. This dust. He fished the folded rag from his pocket, the one he'd used to wipe the spores from Lucia's floor, and handed it to her. Sophia unfolded it carefully, her nose wrinkling at the faint glow still clinging to the fabric. She scraped a sample onto a fresh slide and peered through the scope again. Same thing, she muttered, then straightened, her face hardening. This isn't new, Mateo. It's old, ancient maybe, buried deep until you dug it up. Fungi like this, they can lie dormant for centuries, waiting for the right conditions. The pampas are full of secrets, floods, droughts. They shift the soil. You woke it. Her words landed like a blow, and he staggered back a step, his breath catching. Guilt surged through him. He'd done this, brought this plague to his home, his daughter, his people. Lucia looked up, her voice small but sharp. Mama's not coming back, is she? The question pierced Mateo, and he crossed to her, kneeling to meet her eyes. "No, mija," he said, forcing the words out. "That wasn't her. It's something else." She nodded, slow and hollow, her fingers tracing the rosary beads as tears slipped down her cheeks. Sophia paced, her mind racing ahead. "It's using memory," she said, piecing it together aloud. "The people it mimics, they're not random. Clara, Pedro, the others, they're who you loved, who you lost. It's pulling them from your heads, building them from what you remember, then spreading through the spores. That's why they don't talk much, just enough to draw you in." She glanced at Ramon, who muttered, "Pedro," between coughs, his eyes glassy with fevered longing. Mateo's gaze drifted to the window, where the pampas stretched silent and vast, hiding its rot beneath the grass. "How do we stop it?" he asked, though he feared the answer. Sophia hesitated, then pulled a jar of rubbing alcohol from a shelf, dousing the rag and watching it sizzle faintly as the spores dissolved. "Fire, maybe," she said, "or something stronger. But it's in the air now, in the ground. We'd have to burn it all. Every root, every thing it's made." Her voice faltered, the scale of it sinking in. A sharp clatter broke the tension, the rosary slipping from Lucia's hands, landing on the floor. She bent to grab it, then froze, her breath hitching. "Papa," she whispered, pointing. There, in the yard beyond the window, stood Clara's mimic, her dress swaying in the still air, her head tilted as if listening. She raised a hand, beckoning, and spores drifted from her fingers, catching the sunlight. Mateo lunged to the window, slamming the shutters closed, but not before the scent slipped through. Damp, earthy, alive. "It followed us," he said, his voice trembling with rage and fear. Sophia grabbed a knife from the table, her knuckles whitening around the handle. "It's learning," she said. "It wants more." Ramon coughed again, a thread of white curling from his mouth, and Lucia pressed against Mateo, her small frame shaking. Outside, the mimic stood motionless, waiting, as the pampas whispered with the rustle of unseen roots stretching deeper into the earth. Chapter 7. The Mimicry. Dusk settled over the pampas like a heavy veil, the sky bleeding into deep purples and grays, the grasslands fading into shadow. Mateo drove the truck back to the farmhouse, the engine's growl a frail defiance against the dread coiling in his chest. Lucia sat beside him, her rosary clutched tight, her silence louder than any words. Sophia's revelation echoed in his mind, the fungus pulling Clara from his memories, weaving her shape from spores and longing. He'd woken it, and now it was here, stalking them across the plains. In the truck bed, Don Ramon's coughs had quieted, his breathing shallow, a grim reminder of what awaited if they faltered. The farmhouse loomed ahead, its weathered walls stark against the twilight. Mateo killed the engine, the silence rushing in, thick with the hum of crickets and the faint rustle of grass. He helped Ramon inside, settling him on the worn sofa, where the old man slumped, muttering, "Pedro." Through cracked lips, Lucia lingered near the door, her eyes darting to the windows, searching the dark. "She's out there, isn't she?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Mateo didn't answer, couldn't. He locked the door, the bolt sliding home with a hollow thud, and checked the shutters, sealing the house against the night. The air inside was stale, tinged with that sour, fungal scent that seemed to seep through the cracks. He lit the kerosene lamp, its flicker casting jagged shadows across the room. Clara's photograph still lay face down on the table, a small mercy. He turned to Lucia, forcing calm into his voice. "Stay here with Ramon. I'll check upstairs." She nodded, small and fragile, and he climbed the steps, his boots heavy on the creaking wood. Her room was as they'd left it, the quilt rumpled, the corner where she'd seen Clara empty, except for that faint dusting of spores, still glowing faintly on the floor. He swept it up with a rag, his hands shaking, and stuffed it into his pocket. A soft knock came from below, 3 gentle taps, deliberate, at the front door. Matteo froze, his pulse hammering. He descended slowly, each step a weight, and found Lucia, standing rigid, staring at the door. "It's her," she breathed, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and hope. Before he could stop her, she reached for the bolt, her fingers trembling. "No!" Matteo lunged, pulling her back, his grip firm on her shoulders. The knock came again, softer, and then a voice, Clara's voice, low and tender. "Lucia, mi amor, let me in." Matteo's heart twisted, a sharp ache of longing piercing the fear. He pressed Lucia behind him, facing the door. "You're not her," he said, his voice rough, loud enough to drown the whisper. The words felt like a betrayal, but he clung to Sophia's truth. This was a thing, not his wife. The knob rattled, a faint scrape of something against the wood, and then silence. He held his breath, waiting until Lucia gasped, pointing to the window beside the door. There she stood, Clara, or what wore her face. Her dark hair framed a pale, perfect visage, her eyes too still, her smile soft and unchanging. She pressed a hand to the glass, her fingers splayed, and Matteo saw it, the skin too smooth, too soft, like wax melting under heat, and thin tendrils curling from her nails, pulsing faintly. Spores drifted from her, a faint cloud shimmering in the lamplight filtering through the shutters. "Matteo," she said, her voice a perfect echo of memory. "I've missed you." Lucia sobbed, pressing against him, her small hands clutching his shirt. "Make her go away, Papa," she pleaded, her voice breaking. Matteo grabbed a broom from the corner, his hands trembling with rage and grief, and slammed the handle against the window. The glass rattled but held, and Clara's mimic tilted her head, unfazed, her smile widening. "Lucia needs me," she said, her tone lilting, and stepped closer, her hand smearing spores across the pane. He swung again, harder, and the shutter cracked, splintering inward. The mimic reached through the gap, her arm unnaturally long, her fingers brushing the air inches from Lucia's face. Matteo dropped the broom and seized a knife from the table, slashing at the arm. It gave way with a wet, tearing sound, collapsing into a pile of spores and pale threads that writhed briefly before stilling. The figure staggered back, her form dissolving into a cloud of dust that scattered into the night, leaving only that sour stench behind. Lucia crumpled to the floor, sobbing, and Matteo knelt beside her, pulling her close. "She's gone," he said, though the words felt hollow. The air was thick with spores now, a faint haze settling over the room, and Ramon coughed harder, a thread of white curling from his mouth. Matteo's eyes stung, his throat tightening. He'd driven it off, but it wasn't gone. It was in the house, in the village, in them. He locked the door again, his hands slick with sweat, and glanced at Clara's photograph, still hidden from view. Outside, the pampas whispered, the grass swaying, as if alive, and he knew the mimic would return. stronger, smarter, wearing her face until they broke. Lucia clung to him, her rosary pressed between them, and he wondered how long he could protect her from the thing he'd set loose. Chapter 8. The Infestation. The night deepened over the pampas, a starless void pressing against the farmhouse, the air thick with the weight of something unseen. Mateo sat by the broken window, the knife still clutched in his hand, its blade stained with a faint smear of white from the mimic's severed arm. The pile of spores and threads had dissolved into the floorboards, leaving a faint, glowing stain that pulsed like a heartbeat. Lucia huddled on the sofa beside Don Ramon, her rosary a lifeline in her trembling fingers, her eyes fixed on the shuttered windows. Ramon's coughs had grown sporadic, each one a wet rasp that left threads of white curling from his lips, his skin paling to a sickly gray. Mateo's chest ached, a dull burn creeping into his lungs. He'd breathed the spores, he knew it, felt it settling there like damp earth. The farmhouse creaked around them, the wind rattling the walls, but beneath it a fainter sound hummed, a low, rhythmic pulse, like roots shifting under the foundation. He stood, his legs unsteady, and checked the locks again, though he knew doors wouldn't hold this thing. Clara's mimic was out there, waiting, and the village. He couldn't think of the village, not yet. A sharp cry split the night, distant from the direction of the houses a mile away. Then another, and another, a chorus of voices rising and falling, some joyous, some panicked. Mateo cracked a shutter, peering into the dark. Pinpricks of light flickered in the village. Lanterns, torches, and silhouettes moved. Too many, too strange. The returned were there, he was sure of it. Their waxy forms weaving among the living, shedding spores that glinted in the glow. He slammed the shutter closed, his heart pounding. "They're everywhere," he muttered, more to himself than Lucia. She looked up, her face pale, her voice small. "What do we do, Papa?" He wanted to lie, to promise safety, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he grabbed a lantern from the shelf, its flame flaring as he lit it. "We go back," he said, the decision forming as he spoke. "To the grave. It started there. I'll end it there." Lucia's eyes widened, but she nodded, rising to follow him. Ramon stirred, mumbling, "Pedro," but didn't move. His fight was fading. Mateo led Lucia outside, the lantern casting a frail circle of light across the yard. The air was heavy, the sour stench of fungus clinging to every breath. The grave loomed ahead, its mound more disturbed than before. Soil scattered, tendrils thicker now, weaving through the earth like veins. He set the lantern down and grabbed the shovel from the porch, its handle rough against his palms. "Stay back," he told Lucia, his voice firm, and drove the blade into the dirt. The soil gave way easily, too easily, revealing a web of pale roots pulsing beneath. Thicker than before, glistening wetly, threading deeper into the ground. Each strike of the shovel released a faint puff of spores, shimmering in the lantern's glow, and that low hum grew louder, vibrating through his boots. Lucia gasped, pointing. "Papa, look!" He followed her gaze, and his blood ran cold. There, on the surface of the roots, a shape formed. Clara's face faint and fleeting, her features rippling across the fungal mass. She smiled, eyeless, her mouth opening to exhale a cloud of spores that drifted toward him. Mateo stumbled back, coughing as the dust stung his lungs, his vision blurring. The face dissolved, but the roots pulsed faster, stretching outward, burrowing toward the house. He swung the shovel again, hacking at them, and they tore with a wet snap, oozing a thick white sap that smelled of rot. The hum faltered, then surged, a sound that clawed at his skull. "It's alive!" he rasped, slashing harder, desperation fueling each blow. The grave was a pit now, the shroud long gone, swallowed by the mass below. Lucia screamed, clutching her head, and Matteo dropped the shovel, rushing to her. "What's wrong?" he demanded, gripping her shoulders. "I heard her," she sobbed, her eyes wild. "Mama, she's in my head, telling me to come to her." He pulled her close, his heart hammering. The roots were moving, snaking across the yard, threading under the farmhouse's foundation. He grabbed the lantern and hurled it into the pit, the glass shattering, the flame catching the sap with a hiss. Fire flared, bright and hungry, consuming the tendrils, and the hum turned to a shriek, a sound not of this world. The blaze spread, licking at the roots, and Matteo dragged Lucia back as smoke billowed, thick with that fungal stench. The firelight revealed more, thin threads curling from the grass, beyond the grave stretching toward the village, a network vast and unseen. He'd struck at it, but it was bigger than this pit, bigger than them. The farmhouse groaned behind them, its walls trembling as roots pushed through the earth below. Inside, Ramon's cough stopped, replaced by a low moan. Pedro and Matteo knew they were losing ground. The pampas watched, silent and vast, as the fire burned, a fleeting victory against the rot creeping beneath. Matteo held Lucia tight, her tears soaking his shirt, and stared into the flames, knowing the roots were only waiting, growing, reaching for them all. Chapter 9. The Betrayal. The fire at the grave flickered low, its embers casting a dying glow across the pampas, the night swallowing the last wisps of smoke. Matteo stood with Lucia pressed against him, her small frame trembling as the acrid stench of burned fungus lingered in the air. The roots in the pit had charred to blackened husks, their pulsing stilled, but the hum persisted, a faint, insistent throb beneath the earth, threading through the grass like a heartbeat too vast to silence. The farmhouse loomed behind them, its walls creaking as if straining under an unseen weight, and Matteo knew the fire had only wounded the thing, not killed it. He guided Lucia back inside, her steps slow, her eyes glassy with exhaustion, and something else. Something distant. The lantern's light was gone, so he fumbled for a candle on the table, its flame sputtering to life in the stale air. Don Ramon lay still on the sofa, his chest barely moving, his face a mask of gray wax, threads of white curling from his nostrils. Matteo's throat tightened. He was slipping away, lost to the spores, and there was nothing he could do. He turned to Lucia, kneeling to meet her gaze. "We'll leave at dawn," he said, his voice rough but firm. "Get to the city, find help." She nodded, mute, her rosary dangling limp in her hand. The candlelight flickered, shadows dancing across the room, and a soft cough broke the silence. Lucia, her hand flying to her mouth. Matteo's heart sank. "Mija?" he asked, reaching for her, but she pulled back, her cough deepening, a wet rasp that echoed Ramon's. Her eyes widened, then glazed over, a faint shimmer of spores dusting her lips. "No," he whispered, grabbing her shoulders. "Fight it. You're stronger than this." She shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks, and whispered, "She's calling me, Papa." Mama, I can hear her. Before he could respond, a knock sounded at the door, 3 soft taps, deliberate, familiar. Matteo's blood ran cold. He stood, knife in hand, and moved to block Lucia, but she slipped past him, her movements jerky, as if pulled by invisible strings. "Lucia, stop!" he shouted, lunging for her, but she reached the bolt and slid it back, the door creaking open. There stood Clara's mimic, her dark hair swaying in the still air, her smile serene and empty. Spores drifted from her, a faint cloud glowing in the candlelight, and her voice purred, "Mi amor, I'm here." Lucia stepped forward, her arms outstretched, a sob breaking from her throat. "Mama," she cried, and the mimic enfolded her, its waxy arms wrapping tight. Matteo roared, charging with the knife, but the mimic turned, its head tilting unnaturally, and raised a hand. Tendrils shot from its fingers, thin and whip-like, lashing at his arm. The blade clattered to the floor, and he stumbled back, pain searing through him as spores stung his eyes. "Let her go," he bellowed, clawing at the air, but Lucia clung to the mimic, her face buried in its chest, her coughs muffled. The mimic's smile widened, its eyes hollow pools, and it brushed Lucia's hair with a tenderness that mocked Clara's memory. "She needs me," it said, its voice a perfect echo of his wife's, layered with a wet, fungal undertone. Matteo grabbed the broom from the corner, swinging it wildly. The handle struck the mimic's side, and it staggered, its form rippling, skin peeling back to reveal a mass of pulsing threads beneath. Lucia screamed, pulling away, but the mimic seized her wrist, tendrils curling around her arm, anchoring her. Matteo swung again, harder, and the mimic's head snapped back, its neck tearing open to spill a flood of spores and white sap. It collapsed into a writhing heap, its shape dissolving into a pile of fungal rot that quivered briefly before stilling. Lucia fell to her knees, coughing harder now, blood flecking her lips, her eyes wild with terror and confusion. "Papa," she gasped, reaching for him, and he dropped the broom, pulling her into his arms. Her skin was cold, clammy, and faint threads pulsed beneath her wrist, where the mimic had touched her. "I've got you," he said, his voice breaking, though he felt the lie in it. The air was thick with spores, a haze that settled over them, and Ramon's breathing stopped. A final, shuddering exhale. Matteo looked at the pile of rot, then at Lucia, her rosary lost in the chaos, and knew the betrayal wasn't just hers, it was his, for unearthing this curse, for failing to shield her. The farmhouse groaned, the floorboards buckling as roots pushed through, thin and white, threading toward them like fingers. Outside, the pampa stretched silent and vast, the night hiding the village's cries, coughs, pleas, the voices of the returned weaving through the grass. Matteo held Lucia tighter, her coughs echoing in his ears, and stared at the growing roots, knowing they were running out of time. Chapter 10. The Sacrifice. The farmhouse trembled under the weight of the night, its walls groaning as roots threaded through the floorboards, pale and relentless, their faint pulse a mockery of life. Matteo knelt beside Lucia, her small body racked with coughs, blood speckling her lips, her skin cold, where the mimic's tendrils had marked her. The candle flickered on the table, its flame a frail defiance against the dark, casting shadows that danced with the growing fungal threads. Don Ramon lay silent on the sofa, his chest still, his face frozen in a waxen grimace. Another loss to the spores, another wound Matteo couldn't heal. The air was thick, choking with that sour, earthy stench, and every breath burned in his lungs. Lucia's eyes fluttered, glassy with fever, and she whispered, "Papa, it hurts." Her voice was faint, threaded with pain, and Mateo's heart cracked open, spilling rage and despair. He brushed her hair back, his fingers trembling, and forced a steady tone. "I'm going to fix this, mija. I promise." The words tasted like ash. He had no plan, only a gnawing need to strike back at the thing he'd unleashed. The grave's fire had slowed it, but not enough. It was everywhere now, in the house, in her, in him. A sharp rap echoed from the yard. Sophia's voice, cutting through the night. "Mateo, open the door." He staggered to his feet, peering through the cracked shutter. She stood there, her braid wild, a gasoline can in one hand, a machete in the other, her face set with grim resolve. He unbolted the door, and she stepped inside, her eyes widening at the roots curling across the floor, the pile of fungal rot where Clara's mimic had fallen. "It's worse than I thought," she said, her voice tight. "The village, they're gone. Coughing, collapsing, turning into those things." Mateo nodded, numb. "Lucia's sick. Ramon's dead. It's in us too." Sophia knelt by Lucia, checking her pulse, her frown deepening as she saw the white threads pulsing beneath her wrist. "We can't save her here," she said, standing, "but we can stop it at the source, the grave. Burn it all." She hefted the gasoline, her plan clear, brutal. Mateo hesitated, his gaze flicking to Lucia, then to the roots snaking toward them. He had no choice. Inaction was death. He carried Lucia outside, her weight light in his arms, her coughs weakening. Sophia led the way to the grave, the gasoline sloshing in the can, the machete glinting in the moonlight. The pit smoldered still, embers glowing amid the charred roots, but new tendrils had sprouted, thicker, weaving a lattice across the earth. Shadows moved in the distance, villagers, or what was left of them, staggering closer, their waxy faces lit by the faint light, their voices a chorus of pleas and whispers. Clara's mimic emerged among them, her smile serene, her arms outstretched, spores drifting like snow. Sophia doused the pit with gasoline, the sharp tang cutting through the fungal stench. "Get back," she warned, striking a match. Mateo clutched Lucia, stepping away as the flame dropped, igniting the fuel with a whoosh. Fire roared, a hungry beast devouring the roots, and the mimics shrieked, a sound like tearing metal, inhuman and raw. Clara's form lunged forward, her face rippling, tendrils lashing from her hands. "Mateo, don't!" she cried, her voice twisting his gut, but he held firm, shielding Lucia. The other mimics swarmed, their bodies melting into fungal masses as the fire spread, their cries blending into a single, anguished wail. Sophia swung the machete, severing a tendril that reached for her, sap splattering her boots. "It's working!" she shouted, but the ground trembled, a deep groan rising from below. The pit cracked wider, revealing a pulsing mass, vast, breathing, a heart of roots and spores that writhed in the flames. Clara's mimic knelt before it, her form dissolving, her voice softening. "Stay with me, mi amor." Lucia stirred, her hand clutching Mateo's shirt, her rosary dangling from her fingers, clean now, the threads receding from her skin. "Mama," she murmured, and Mateo's resolve faltered. The mimic held out the rosary's twin, its beads glinting, a perfect lure. He could end it, join her, spare Lucia the fight, but Sophia grabbed his arm, yanking him back. "She's not yours," she snapped, and tossed the last of the gasoline into the pit. The fire surged, swallowing the mass, and the mimics collapsed, their forms crumbling to ash. The ground stilled, the hum fading. But Lucia's coughs returned, bloodier now. Mateo sank to his knees, cradling her, the pampa silent around them. The fire burned on, a pyre for the village, for Clara, for hope. Sophia stood watch, machete in hand, her face streaked with soot. The sacrifice had bought them time, but the cost carved itself into Mateo's soul. Chapter 11. The Silence. Dawn broke over the pampas with a stillness that felt wrong. The sky a pale wash of gray streaked with ash, the air heavy with the ghost of smoke. The fire at the grave had burned itself out, leaving a blackened scar in the earth, a pit of charred roots and crumbled ash, silent now, its pulsing hum extinguished. Mateo sat beside it, Lucia cradled in his lap, her breathing shallow, her coughs reduced to faint, rasping gasps. The blood on her lips had dried to a dark crust, and her skin was clammy, but the white threads beneath her wrist had faded, leaving only faint scars. The rosary hung loose in her hand, its beads dulled by soot, a fragile tether to the life they'd known. Sophia stood a few paces away, her machete planted in the ground, her face streaked with grime and exhaustion. The gasoline can lay empty at her feet, its sharp scent swallowed by the lingering rot of burned fungus. She scanned the horizon, her dark eyes sharp despite the weariness pulling at her frame. Sophia approached, her boots crunching on the ash-strewn grass. "We hit it hard," she said, her tone flat, practical, though her gaze softened as it fell on Lucia. "The roots are dead here, at least. But I checked the village on my way back. Everyone's either gone or changed. Coughing, collapsing, sprouting threads. It's still in them, Mateo. We didn't kill it, just pushed it down." She gestured to the pit, where the charred mass lay motionless, a dark heart scorched but not destroyed. "It's deeper than we thought." Mateo's stomach twisted, guilt and dread coiling together. He'd started this, dug into the earth, woken the rot, and now the pampas bore the scars of his mistake. He looked at Lucia, her frail form a mirror of his failure, and then at the plains stretching endless and indifferent. "What now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sophia crouched beside him, resting a hand on his shoulder, a rare gesture of comfort from her steely resolve. "We leave," she said. "Get her to a hospital, somewhere far from here. Burn what's left if we can. But we can't stay, the air's still thick with it." She tapped her chest, a faint cough escaping her lips, and Mateo nodded, feeling the same burn in his own lungs. The spores were in them, dormant perhaps, but waiting. He rose, lifting Lucia gently, her weight a burden he'd carry to the ends of the earth if it meant saving her. They trudged back to the farmhouse, Sophia retrieving her machete, Mateo cradling Lucia as the dawn light crept higher. The truck sat untouched, its keys still in the ignition, a lifeline in the wreckage. He set Lucia in the passenger seat, wrapping her in a blanket from the back, and glanced at the house one last time. The roots hadn't moved, but the floorboards glistened with a faint sheen. Spores settling, biding their time. Sophia poured the last dregs of kerosene from a spare can inside, striking a match and tossing it through the broken window. Flames licked up the walls, a slow, hungry crawl that devoured the past. Clara's photograph, Ramon's body, the life they'd built. The truck rumbled to life, and they drove away, the fire's glow fading in the rear-view mirror. The pampas stretched silent around them, the grass swaying gently, hiding its secrets beneath the surface. Lucia coughed again, softer now, and Mateo gripped the wheel, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Sophia sat in the back, silent, her machete across her lap, watching the plains for any sign of movement. The village receded into the distance, a graveyard of ash and memory, its survivors lost to the rot. As they crested a low hill, the ground trembled, a faint shudder, deep and distant, like a sigh from the earth itself. Mateo's breath caught, his gaze darting to the side, but the grass lay still, the silence unbroken. Beside him, Lucia shifted, her hand tightening on the rosary, and he prayed to God, to Clara, to anything, that the trembling was just the wind, not the roots stirring once more beneath the pampas's endless skin. Chapter 12. The Roots of Mourning. The sun climbed higher over the pampas, its light a pale, unyielding glare that stripped the plains of shadow, revealing a landscape scarred and silent. Mateo stood beside the truck, its engine still warm from the drive, the farmhouse a smoldering ruin in the distance. Black smoke curling into the sky, a funeral pyre for everything he'd lost. Lucia sat in the passenger seat, wrapped in the blanket, her breathing steadier now, though each faint cough sent a jolt through his chest. The rosary rested in her lap, its beads catching the light, a quiet relic of faith amid the ash. Sophia leaned against the truck's tailgate, her machete sheathed, her dark eyes scanning the horizon with a weariness that mirrored his own. They'd packed what little they could salvage: clothes, a canteen, a battered photo of Clara he'd pulled from the wreckage before the flames took it all. The plan was simple: drive north past the pampas to a city with hospitals, with people who might understand what they'd faced. But the weight of the night clung to Mateo, heavier than the dust on his boots. The grave was burned, the mimics reduced to ash, the village a graveyard, yet the silence felt alive, watchful, as if the earth itself held its breath. He glanced at Lucia, her small hand tracing the rosary, and wondered if he'd saved her or merely delayed the inevitable. Sophia climbed into the truck bed, tapping the side. "Let's go," she said, her voice firm but hollow. "The longer we stay, the worse it'll be." Mateo nodded, sliding into the driver's seat, the keys trembling in his hand. The engine roared to life, a rough growl that shattered the stillness, and they rolled forward, the tires crunching over grass and ash. The pampas stretched endless around them, its golden expanse marred by patches of blackened earth, remnants of the fire, scars of their fight. He kept his eyes on the road, a faint dirt track winding north, but his mind drifted to the grave, to that trembling shudder he'd felt at dawn. They passed the village, or what was left of it. Houses stood empty, doors ajar, windows dark, the streets littered with ash piles that had once been mimics, once been people. A child's shoe lay abandoned near the church, its steeple charred and leaning. No coughs, no cries, just silence. A void that swallowed the life they'd known. Mateo's grip tightened on the wheel, guilt gnawing at him. He dug the grave, woken the roots, and now the pampas bore the cost. Lucia bore it, her frail form a testament to his failure. She shifted beside him, her voice soft. "Will it come back, Papa?" The question hung there, fragile and sharp, and he forced a smile, though it felt like a lie. "Not if we keep moving," he said, glancing at her. Her eyes were clearer now, the fever receding, but the faint scars on her wrist pulsed faintly, a reminder of the spores still in her blood, in his, in Sophia's. He wanted to believe the fire had ended it, that the trembling was nothing. But the pampas whispered otherwise, its grass swaying with a rhythm too steady, too alive. Miles away, beyond their sight, another gaucho rode across the plains, his horse kicking up dust as he herded cattle toward a distant ranch. The wind carried a faint sound, a woman's voice, soft and pleading, calling his name. He paused, frowning, his hand resting on the reins. His wife had died years ago, taken by fever, buried beneath the same soil he now crossed. He shook his head, urging the horse forward, but a cough scratched at his throat, dry at first, then wet, a thread of white curling from his lips. In the grass beside him, a single pale tendril broke the surface, thin and glistening, tasting the air with invisible spores. Back in the truck, Mateo drove on, the pampas blurring past, the road stretching toward an uncertain horizon. Sofia tapped the cab's rear window, pointing to a faint plume of smoke far behind. Another fire, perhaps, or the wind stirring the farmhouse's ashes. He didn't look back. Lucia leaned against him, her head resting on his arm, and he felt her warmth, her trust, a fragile thread holding him together. The trembling hadn't returned, the silence held, and for now, that was enough. The truck crested a rise, the plains falling away behind them, and the city's faint outline shimmered in the distance, a promise of safety, of answers. But as they descended, a single white thread curled from the soil near Clara's grave, unseen beneath the ash, its tip quivering with a hunger older than grief. The pampas lay still, its secrets buried deep, waiting for the next touch, the next breath to carry its roots forward. The screen faded to black, and words etched themselves into the darkness. March 25th, 2025. Grief grows where it's buried.